Hello YouTube, I'm David and welcome back to another episode of Raw History.
Humans started out in Africa. Agriculture changed everything. Staying in one place does have its advantages for humans. Agriculture was the dawn of settlement, and settlement was the birthplace of civilization.
Now we're going to pick up from where that left off and look at the story of how some small settlements became the world's first superpowers that dominated history and continue to dominate our popular culture today. It's time to enter the era of civilization and history as we know it.
We don't need no education. We don't need no thought control.
So if you remember last week, I went on and on and on about the awesomeness of agriculture. And I promised to tone that down a little bit this week. But agriculture did do so much more than just change hunter-gatherers into little civilization builders. It changed human behaviour in a really fundamental way. Because of agriculture, settlements benefited from a food surplus, which means more food was produced than could possibly be consumed. And this left settlements with one of two options. Either you could store it for the future, or you could trade it. Now, if you're trading for your food instead of hunting for it, then that means you're free to think about anything other than where is my next meal coming from and how am I going to get it. For the first time, your mind is free to wander and you can contemplate things like life and creation and why are we here? You're free to think about the bigger questions. Concepts like religion began to really enter the human consciousness, and because of population increases, large numbers of people began to amass in a single place, which led to a new concept of a king, or a ruler that could rule all these people despite the fact he's never met them before. But okay, wait, I need to slow down because I'm getting way ahead of myself. First, we need to look at where did civilization start. The ancient Egyptians, the ancient Mesopotamians, and the ancient Chinese are all considered amongst the first civilizations, and it's absolutely true, they were amongst the first civilizations. But why? What made them so special? They weren't the first settlements. There were small villages located on rivers that used agriculture and all that good stuff from last episode, but they aren't considered civilizations. There are a few factors that settlements need before they can flourish into states or civilizations that are recognized by history. Firstly, independent communities need to come together to form a collective. They need something to unify them, and this brings us to the second most important thing in creating civilization as we know it. And that's religion. If you stay with me, I'll talk about the number one most important thing in a few minutes. But first, religion. Now, we know religion is nothing new amongst humans. I mean, cavemen had ideas about supernatural forces and creation entities, but about 6,000 years ago, and this is because of food surplus, human psyche began to consider gods in a much more complex way, and we became obsessed with knowing the will of our gods and connecting with them through either prayer or offerings. Now, religion also united communities, because although two villages may have been separated for whatever reason, if they had the same religion, then they were praying to the same gods, and they were celebrating the same festivals and making offerings at the same time, and their holy men and priests were preaching the same ideals. It also perpetuated in us and them ideology, an ideology which in the past 6,000 years, humans have had a great deal of trouble letting go of. People believed that if their religion was correct, then everyone else's religion must be wrong, and thus they are an enemy. Sound familiar? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And so for defensive reasons, people with the same religion would come together and trade exclusively, which suggests some kind of common language. We'll talk more about language later. But for now, large towns and walled cities began to emerge, and these were mostly theocracies, which meant that the power and authority lay with the priests, and the religion was at the centre of all authority. Now, these priests and holy men, or as they were seen, liaisons between the humans and the divine, flexed their figurative muscles by ordering these huge projects to celebrate the gods. Yeah. So now we're deep on the road from settlement to civilization, and we can see a hierarchy begin to form, where the masses are commanded by their powerful and glorious leaders. However, we also begin to see a subtle but super important shift in mentalities in this period, and all of a sudden, civilization started to look inwards. Temples were replaced by palaces, and power changed from the gods to humans. High priests, who were seen as liaisons with the gods, started to become gods themselves. And we see the emergence of a god king. Social hierarchy with a small number of rulers at the top and all the masses at the bottom is something that almost every society in the world is familiar with today. But about 6,000 years ago, at the dawn of civilization, this was a revolution in human societies. Large numbers of people were united under the rule of a single authority figure that they would probably never meet in their entire lives. Gone were the days of small communities being ruled by a local leader or a chief. Now huge swathes of people were living together under the rule of one man. Because these kings ruled over so many people, their reputations became embellished, and amongst their subjects they began to be seen as gods, or at least semi-divine in some way. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were believed to be gods in human form. In ancient China, the mandate of heaven was considered a divine document which bestowed upon the emperor the god's will that they should rule, and in ancient Mesopotamia, a long line of god kings was supposedly descended from the demigod Gilgamesh. So if religion is the second most important factor on the road to civilization, then surely divine kingship must be the third most important. Now I promise I will talk about the number one factor soon, but let's just take a moment to look at some of these first ever recorded kings of history. This is Alulim. He was the first king of Eridu and Sumer. Sumer was a great and early civilization in the region of Mesopotamia, which is roughly modern-day Iraq. In fact, Sumer means the land of civilized kings, which implies some kind of self-awareness. They took pride in being a civilization and having their own state and unique culture. Now back to Alulim. This guy supposedly has the distinction of being the first ever king. He is thought to have descended from heaven sometime around the 35th to the 30th century BCE, although according to legend he ruled for 29,000 years, so we may be playing a little fast and loose with the term historical fact at this point. Now also in Mesopotamia, which really is the cradle of civilization, we find the emergence of the first ever city. This is Uruk. Now unfortunately it has nothing to do with Lord of the Rings, but it was considered the unofficial capital of the Sumerian civilization. It was founded about 6,000 years ago, and at the height of its power it had up to 80,000 residents. In the ancient world, that's mind-blowing. So at this time, kings didn't necessarily rule countries as they did later in history, but instead they ruled city-states like Uruk. Now, there were 4 kings of Uruk, and like Alulim, they were mostly probably mythological. But the 5th king of Uruk was relatively famous, and if you're interested in ancient history, you may have heard of him. This is the legendary Gilgamesh, who supposedly built the walls of Uruk with his bare hands. Now, as with all historical figures, the story of Gilgamesh's life has probably been embellished over time, most notably by the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, in which he stars as the main character. However, Gilgamesh has also seeped into our popular culture. And did you know, in the 1970s, Gilgamesh was a member of Marvel's The Avengers? I'm not kidding. I have a book of The Avengers, and there's Gilgamesh, right in front of the Fantastic Four. Gilgamesh is superhumanly strong and virtually immortal. His eyes or hands project cosmic energy, and he has a vast knowledge of ancient combat techniques. Okay, so that's a bit of fun. But it does demonstrate how this ancient dawn of civilization era really resonates with our culture today. Okay, so there's one more early king that I want us to talk about before we move on. And unlike Gilgamesh or Alulim, this guy was definitely real. He also changed the definition of what it meant to be a king. Through conquest, he united hundreds of villages and towns into one state. So he effectively created the first ever country. And it's a country that's borders have changed very little in the past 5,000 years. This is Pharaoh Nama, also known as Menes, and he was the founder of the first dynasty of Egypt, the longest lasting civilization of all time, as well as the one that has captured our imagination more than any other. All started with this god king. So I keep saying he and king, because although there were queens of the ancient world, they were very rare and very few and far between. As social structures in society became more complex, they also became way more rigid. And I'm not saying that sexism or racism were invented in this period per se, but for the elites living on the top rung of society, defining people in groups of other or lesser was the most efficient way of herding their people and maintaining complete obedience. It's true that civilization gave us some really good things like longer lifespans and governments and religions, but it also gave us some really bad things like longer lifespans and governments and religion. I've said that religion was the second most important factor and god kings were the third most important factor. But now let's look at the number one most important milestone on the highway from settlement to civilization. Without this, I really don't think humans could have advanced beyond small isolated farming villages, and we certainly couldn't have reached the levels of civilization that we have today. This is Gar-Ama, and he lived in 3100 BCE. Now, we don't have a picture of Gar-Ama because, unlike Alulim or Gilgamesh or Pharaoh Nama, he wasn't anyone particularly special. Yet, Gar-Ama had a level of immortality that no one before him had ever managed to achieve. He was a Sumerian scribe, and his work is the first ever example that archaeologists have found of writing. And what's more, he signed his name at the bottom of the little tablets that he wrote on. He gave us the first ever autograph. And so we know his name. Now I know what you're thinking. Once again, I'm getting very excited about something that's really not that exciting. But writing really is that exciting. We know Gar-Ama existed, and we know he lived in Uruk, and we know enough about him to still be talking about him thousands of years after he died. And that's because he wrote things down for us to read. Well, he didn't write things down for us to read, but he wrote things down and we get to read them. It's no coincidence that the Sumerians of Uruk were the first people to have writing, and they're also the first civilization. Their words lasted beyond the author's death, and with writing we get documents that last and aren't subject to change or embellishment over the millennia, unlike oral traditions that came before. They are fixed, and once translated, they're studyable. But although the advent of writing is a game changer for historians and archaeologists, it was even more significant for the people living 5,000 years ago. Because of writing, huge ideas and advancements could be accurately passed down through generations and added to over time. Messages could travel from one corner of a civilization to another. Records could be kept of a king's subjects, which allowed him to tax them and build up a state. Information could spread like wildfire, which in turn allowed for the mass expansion of empires. Financial accounts, historical records, and complex mathematics all came into being with writing. And the power of memory was no longer the limit for human communication. Writing even allowed men and women like Gar-Ama to share their ideas with us and break down the seemingly impenetrable boundaries of time. And so with that, history as we know it began. Civilizations turned into states, which turned into superpowers, which eventually turned into empires. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on whether I think that we were better off before or after civilization, because that's such a huge question, but please keep the discussion going in the comment section below this video. And if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future Raw History videos. So unfortunately, that's all I have time for, but my head scratcher of the week is, why does skating on thin ice land you in hot water? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you same time next week.